Dear friends, there seems to have been a demand for classes in English since Pesach and always is a time to answer people's questions and requests. So I want to give over and try to speak about some of the things that I've been discovering recently. I've been learning mostly in Hebrew classes that happened in the last 2 weeks, mostly based on the Kavanas Arizal for Pesach. There are some points, some ideas, some organizing ideas, not only just ideas, but organizing ideas, which seem to be very powerful to me, both in understanding the historical or historiographical or historiosophical understanding of the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim, which is, of course, the story of the minds and the souls and hearts of the Jewish people, which we are, and maybe more than that, as we'll see. So I want to try to discuss it. Now, as usual, I can't read texts. I assume that everyone who listens to my class could read Hebrew. So, and it's not really it's not really possible for me to show my work and showing you how I got what I want to say out of the text that I read them in. I can just give you the sources, the Mari Makoimis, where it's from, and you'll look in it and you'll try to go through the sources of those sources and how they're putting together things. Maybe you'll try to be able to see where I'm coming from. So my sources are mostly the Shara Kavanas in the beginning of Pesach, and then two other sources in Shara Mitzvahs in Parshas Re'eh, where it's the mitzvah of Zichiras Yetzias Mitzrayim, and Shara Psukim in Parshas Shemos. Mostly, those are the three main sources in Kisva Arizal for what I want to discuss, and you could read them inside and see if it says what I say or it doesn't. I want to give one general introduction as to what I'm doing with these things. So everyone knows there's different levels of understanding, different levels of mind, or different levels of organization which exist in the universe, and just like they exist in the universe, exist in the Torah. I'm never sure where I'm starting, like who I'm speaking to, and how many things I can assume. And there's many different ways of making all these things make sense or connecting them to something that is the sense that we're making out of things. But in the most basic sense, people talk about levels of organization, or levels of complexity, or levels of emergence, or where you see it top to bottom or bottom up, depending on your perspective or depending on your philosophy. But these are different levels. Like, for example, you can describe a room in the physical level, like what kind of wood and what kind of materials it's made out of. It can be described on a biological level. In other words, even the room, the physical level of the room, like the tables, the chairs, the wood that it's built out of, the engineering that goes into it. It can be described as a habitat, a home for living things. And then that gives you a different picture of what the structure is, of what the building is, right? And then we can describe things on a social level, whether social for animals or social for human animals, which will give you another story about what this is really about. And then we can describe things on an intellectual level, which might talk about the engineering that goes into it. So in some ways, intellectual level can explain lower levels also, or can talk about, if there's a social group of people that get together in a certain house, let's say a house of learning, called a Bet Midrash. A Bet Midrash, someone would define a Bet Midrash as a place made out of wood and beautiful windows. He'd probably be wrong, although it's not wrong. In other words, there is a certain kind of windows, there's a certain kind of decor, there's a certain kind of engineering that is appropriate for a place of learning, and that needs to be strong enough for people to jump up and down when they're arguing and learning. And needs to be, needs to have good acoustics, whatever. There's different things that need to go into the physical makeup of the building in order for it to be a good place of learning. But that's not what anyone means when they talk about a house of learning, a Beit Midrash. What they talk about is the social conditions, right? The people that come there, what kind of people come there, what kind of relationships that they have to each other, And really, that is only a introduction, only a prerequisite to the actual learning that's going on. And it's the kind of intellect, the kind of intelligence, the kind of thought that it happens in that space. Now, thought doesn't really happen in space at all, so that sort of flew out of the building already, but it still happens in the space, right? Human thought happens in a space. So these are levels that exist. And in Kabbalah, they're very, very used to speaking about different levels. Nefesh, Ruach, Neshama, Chai, Yechida, or Atzilus, Brei, Yetzira, Asiya, which is top-down level. Different ways of talking of these same kind of ideas in every level and so on. And most importantly, this is why I have to give this preface, it's true for reading of the Torah, or reading of maybe of any text, but especially texts that are taken to be sacred texts and holy texts and texts which are meaningful to the organization of the people who are reading them, the meaning of the kind of souls and the kind of life of the people that are reading them. And which means that a text can be analyzed at many levels. We could talk about the literal level, and we could talk even below the literal level, right? When we say the literal level of a text, we're already not speaking about anything physical, right? Because nobody, unless you're like researching the material conditions of the book, or the, what kind of paper it's made out of, or what kind of ink it's made out of, or, and that's true. A book demands a certain kind of material conditions, right? There's difference between a book written on parchment and a book written on vellum and a book written on paper and a book written on a computer program. All of these things are different. They have a different kind of materiality. And it makes a difference maybe in what kind of things can be written on them. If you're writing in stone, you probably want to write shorter things because it's a lot of effort, a lot of energy to write things in stone like the Luchot Abris. And you're writing on parchment and you get space for more words, ability. So these are true. There's always the bottom level, also always influences what can be on top. And this is an important point when we discuss this idea of different levels. So they're not distinct, they're not independent of each other, at least not for the most part. There's an independence, but they're mostly not independent of each other. But for the most part, when we talk about text, we start with the literal level, like the meaning of the words, meaning of the sentences, what's known sometimes as the historical meaning, what the author meant, or what the first audience understood it to mean, because when you speak of it, sacred text, and the author doesn't really count because it's God. So it's not really what the author meant, but it's what historical meaning, or what it meant in its first context. And then people talk about higher levels, like people often think of midrash or moralistic interpretations, or called it allegorical interpretations, but usually what gets people interested is like, people say, how is this relevant to my life? And usually what they mean is, well, what does this story teach me in some way? And that's like it's not only like, to be clear about this, there's some kind of truth corresponding to the kind of element or the kind of thing that the text is conveying, which has that level. In other words, just like a story, sometimes that's the literal meaning, right? Sometimes the story is written in order to give you a certain message, or to give you a moral message, in order to give you a Muslim message. That's sometimes what the story is for. But there's always that, at least for human stories. I don't know about, it's a good question if non-human stories are like this. Maybe, there's animal proverbs and animal allegories and stuff like that, very ancient literature that work like that. But at least for human stories, everything that humans do, at least we assume, at least for practical purposes, have a moral valence to them. So it's either good or bad. And if you have a moral outlook on the world, and this is very important, right? Because the basic belief of Torah and of all religions, or really all moral systems almost, is that morality is part of the description of the world. It's not something that exists in us, it's something that exists in the world, which means that at least for human action, there's what someone does can always be described as he did a good thing or a bad thing, and that also always will cause good or bad things. And of course, we've got the problem of evil. Sometimes it doesn't work out, but that problem is only a problem if you assume that there's some connection, there's some so-called scientific truth, there's some kind of relation between what you do in the moral sense, what you do, and what's done to you in the moral sense, right? The same way as in the scientific, sort of physical level, we say there's a relation. If you do something, things will be done. If I move my hand, the hand will move. If I drop a table, the table will drop, and I'll hurt my foot if it happens to be there. That's all things that happen on the sort of physical level of cause and effect. There's also a moral cause and effect level, so that's part of the description of the universe, and therefore part of the description of someone telling you a story, right? If someone tells you a story, there were people in Egypt, and then they went out, there's some kind of moral to that, some kind of moral teaching in that, there's some kind of moral meaning to that. And that's what Midrash, many parts of it are doing, which is just extracting or elevating the text to that level, or reading it on that higher conceptual level. No, that's all true. And then there's even I don't want to like the word deeper, but more broader or higher conceptual levels. Higher conceptual means more complex and more broader concepts, right? So at least the way we're thinking now, the physical level can only explain simple things, right? Explains the movement of things, doesn't explain human action, doesn't explain maybe even natural action. And then the moral level is good for human action. It's not clear what exactly it does, but that's a different problem that we're not talking about right now. And then all of this needs to be explained on what can be called sometimes intellectual or theological level. And that is an entirely different story. So we have to be clear. When we say theological level, we don't mean the moralistic part of theology, right? And that's what many people seem to get stuck at, right? Of course, there's a theological like a moral or ethical aspect of belief, right? We say if you believe in monotheism, certain kinds of concepts of what is good follow from that. If you believe in reward and punishment, only a certain motivation for being good, but also a certain conception of what the good, like we just discussed. Reward and punishment is really the idea that the moral good that people do has something to do with how the world works, with at least how the human world works, and maybe even more than that, but at least that. Right? So if you do good things, you'll become a good person. That's one thing. Maybe the world will be good to you. That's another level. But at least there's some connection between these two things. So, and of course, at least for some version of this, God is the one acting in it, right? Why is it good for you to do good things? Because God will reward you. Or what is the ultimate reason for doing all of this? Because it's God's will, or because God has that plan, or kind of things like that. Or different, if you don't believe in God, you talk about yetzias mitzrayim, right? If you don't believe in God, then maybe you tend to take whatever social structure you're born in as the way the world must be. And if you're born a slave, or if you're born a owner of slaves, then that's just and right. And you should be a slave, or your slaves should continue to be slaves for you, and so on. And like one of the big ideas of yetzias mitzrayim happens to be that since, like it says in the Pusik, Avadaihem, Asher Tzesios Eretz Mitzrayim, we are God's slaves, or things ultimately belong to God, humans especially, and especially these people, but really humans in general, belong to God and not to other humans. In other words, if you see humans belonging to other humans, that is a sort of mistake. That is something wrong with that. Maybe they did something wrong and that happened to them and so on, but we don't ultimately belong to any other human. We only belong to God, right? Hashem Elokechem Malkechem. We don't even belong to a Jewish king, right? Don't even belong to Shaul HaMelech. You belong to God, and that's a very important sort of theological, political, moral lesson, right? It's saying God is your king, not Pari is not your king, and therefore, maybe therefore revolt against Pari, maybe therefore don't, and wait for God to take you out of the Mitzrayim. Different precise conclusions, but this is like a theological principle that is mostly interesting, or mostly said for its moral value, for its motivation to human action, for the kind of demands it makes on humans, and things like that. And most people, people often talk about Judaism as ethical monotheism. That's a very modern formulation. But there's like an ethical demand that believing in God puts on you. In other words, it creates a certain kind of world. It creates a certain kind of idea of what humans should be and could be. But the thing with all of this, that's all one level. And I think I put all of this sort of into the Midrash level or into the moral level. But there's really higher level. And the higher level obviously has also some kind that we could call it an ethical implication, but it's really beyond what we usually call ethics, which is a sort of limited way of thinking about humans even. Because humans, besides for having actions, have thought, right? And even beyond thought, there might be some other things beyond thought, which would hard to talk about because they're beyond thought. And that means that the ultimate explanation or the ultimate place of reality, even for humans, at least for those humans capable of thought, maybe not everyone is capable of it, but the humans capable of thought, is going to have to take place in a different realm, a different level. and then we call this theology, but theology in the sense of, like they used to call it first philosophy, or theology in the sense of the things that are really happening in some sense from God's perspective, right? In other words, from the perspective of reality itself, not from the perspective of us, not from the perspective of, the physical level, not even from the perspective of the moral or ethical or political level, but from the perspective of the ontology, from the perspective of how the world really works, and from the highest organizing principles that we can get at, right? So there's some organizing principle, like, which says that moving things continue to move, and all kind of physical principles like that. But then there's, according to at least, these kind of ways of thinking, there are more abstract principles, and more what we call sometimes ruchaniyut, don't like that word, higher principles or higher level principles, right? Principles that organize more than that, right? So they organize both society and both God's relation to the world, what kind of thing the world is and could be, the entire world, and including human culture, including plants and animals and rocks, but also going all the way to the principles that are really God's principles. Okay. Now, this is like the third or fourth level, depending on how you want to cut them up. I'm not worried about the exact numbers of levels right now. Now, this is very important. Now, why is this very important? Now, this is general. This account is general. The general account of what Kabbalah thinks of the Torah as. In other words, they say, well, you can understand it on a practical level, right? The historical level, or sometimes we say the halachic level, right? You shall do this, which is all halachas are. At least almost all of them are for the physical world. You shall do this in the physical world. Your body should move in a certain way. Your body should have matzahs in it on Pesach, and so on. We could talk about it in the sort of emotional, or sometimes called spiritual, or sometimes called ethical world is probably the best way of speaking about it. In language of Kabbalah, it would be ruach. But anyways, the first thing would be nefesh, second thing would be ruach, in general terms. And that's what most people that are trying to go deeper or trying to find meaning usually are stuck at. And then you can have something beyond that, which is in Kabbalah terms we call neshama, which is Olam Habriya at least, and beyond that, which is the truly divine principles, which is Olam Hatzilas. And that's really where meaning is. In other words, meaning doesn't mean feeling of meaning, right? Meaning means what the definition, what the essence of the thing is really. And that's a human, it's definitely a human need, just like every other need. Like, people talk about meaning in this nowadays because it's like a trick for us to get into it, since people don't start off believing in intellect, people don't start off believing in mind, people don't start off believing in divine organizing principles that actually explain everything. Even people that believe in God sort of have like a God and then everything else. So there isn't like a way to explain how God actually explained the world. Nobody really has a way to do that nowadays, besides for the Kabbalah. Or at least that have that hope. If they have a way is another question. But at least for the text, they have a way. Now, so this is the fourth principle, or the third or fourth principle, and humans need that. And that's if anyone has felt the drive to know, which is distinct from the drive to be a good person. Although people want to make that into the same thing, but it's another kind of way of being a good person, right? Or distinct from the need to feel important, or to feel needed, or to all kind of things that we talk about usually when we say meaning. That's something else. Now, the important thing, and the Mekabalim in general take the Torah to be, at least ultimately, right, what we call derech emes, in the sense of al derech emes mean al derech reality, right, and derech ontology, al derech theological first principles, to be about that, right? Of course, the Torah tells you how to act. Of course, it tells you how to feel, or how to move towards correct feelings, and so on. But it must also reveal the truth. Otherwise, it would be worthless. Right? The Rambam says explicitly, any Torah that is only help you to live in this world is not a divine Torah. It's a very good thing. It's a very good way to organize society, but it's not divine. What we call Torah min hashemayim. In other words, maybe it's min hashemayim, but it's not. Doesn't have the shemayim. And now. And that's what the Mekbalim care about. They care about this, and they have their ideas of the divine principles, and they have names for them, called 10 Sefirot, and so on. And they have names for the divine principles active in humans, called Neshamot, and levels of Neshamot. Now, this is the story that they're interested in when they read the Torah. That's the story that they're looking for. Now, one important thing to notice is, and this is where I am right now, is that having this story, and this is important, doesn't mean is not something that happens in its own realm. In other words, if you, for example, read the story of yetzias mitzrayim and the mitzvahs of Pesach and the story of Jewish people in general, the story of humanity in general, which is the story of Sefer Bereshis, Shemas, and so on, you could say like, okay, there's one story which is we should eat matzah, and then there's another story which is we should care about Moich and the Abba and whatever matzah is according to Kabbalah, and that's all right. Like can have one shir in Pshat and Chumash, I could have another shir in Halacha, I could have another shir in Medrash and Musar, and I could have another shir Kabbalah, and these four shiurim will not talk to each other much, and people, the distinction is important to notice also. But in reality, and this is not correct. Why is it not correct? Because this is just like, well, firstly for the way up, because there's, in other words, because there's a reason why we talk about these higher principles, right? It's not just because, I don't know, someone wasn't happy with this world or something like that. It's because they don't actually explain enough, right? It's because you say, well, what is it for? And when you say, what is it for? Like there's 4 questions, right? And one of the ways of saying 4 questions is to say the same question again, right? There's chamishim sharei bina, which are asking why 50 times. And, or what, or why, doesn't really matter. And when you ask it again, and you see, well, the answer is to be a good person, and then you say, well, what's that for? And then you have to get to more higher principles. Maybe you don't stop there either, but at least there's a way up, which shows that. Now, if you don't go that way up, this is very important. If it just imposed on you, then it's not really interesting, right? Because one of the problems that many people have with all of this is that, all right, it seems to be a nice story if you believe in it, but why would I believe in it? Or why would I need to believe in it? And then some people give an answer, well, because it helps you live your life, because we could learn moral lessons from it. And that's not a good answer, very bad answer. And according to the Kabbalah itself, it's a very bad answer. Because that's not true, because all the moral principles, later you'll see why it is true, but for all, in general, all the moral and chizuk and inspiration that people take from all of these things seem to be inspiration that can be had without it. Because it doesn't seem to rely on any higher principles. It's just inspiration. Inspiration is a very important thing, but take it wherever you can get it. But why would you need to jump to Olam Atzilas to get inspiration? What's wrong with the inspiration of Olam Yetzira? It seems to be fine to me. And so that's not the reason. So that's not why it's for. It's only for if you actually go through the inspiration, and that's why in general there's a reason why people have talked about not touching these things until you're at a certain stage or a certain level or a certain age. And mostly because it doesn't make sense. It's not out of badness. It's not out of trying to be elite or something like that. It's out of just the way the thing works. And it's sort of sad when people get things imposed on them, like you shall believe this and you shall have this kavanah and so on. And you don't know why you should have that. What's wrong with living life without it? What's wrong with being a yid without it? And then, it's sort of useless. This is one of the big tragedies of that I keep on meeting it. Anyways, so of course that's one reason. In other words, you've got to go through it, and you've got to do it. You've got to have, practical good. You've got to have emotional good. You have even health, be inspired, right? Now, one way, and this is a true way, people get into these things is by being sick, right? By falling down. It's a true way, because it's true that it works like this, but I'm not going to get to the explanation of it right now. But in other words, if the halacha doesn't work for you, if the pshat doesn't work, many people get into this, we took yetzias mitzrayim. Who knows if it ever happened? No historian has ever found Pari's dreams in the archaeology or whatever. So who cares? And anyways, and if it did happen, who cares? It seems to be ancient history. I mean, it is ancient history. So if we talk about yetzias mitzrayim and some kind of inspirational level, it inspires us to get out of our mitzrayim and our problems. Okay, that's very nice. So that's one way in which people get out beyond levels. Or if someone would say even more than that, if someone can say, yeah, the Jewish people are into doing things, and who cares about that? But God being the cause of everything, and God being present to things, that's something interesting. That's interesting. If I wouldn't be Jewish, it would be interesting too. It's interesting as a human being. Oh, now there's this Zohar that explains this is the pshat of matzah. Okay, so that's a good reason to eat matzah. There's a ways of getting to it, and they're legitimate ways, and there's a reason, ontological reason, according to the theory, why it happens like that the higher things surpass the lower things. So even when the lower things don't work, the higher things still work. And that's one way in which people get into it. At least in that way, you don't have the problem of it just being an imposition, like you shall believe. Okay, that's one way. But that's like a sort of a sick way, right? I mean, it's a shame that we have to do it that way. Like the real way would be, like I've got it, like the Medrash says about Shlomo HaMelech. Like it's, of course, one way to realize that this world is not worth that much is by being poor and trying to find a way to survive within being poor. So you say, well, it's not so important whether you're rich or poor. But a better way, and actually a more complete way, a more healthy way, I'd say the word healthy, I don't know what it means. But a more complete way would be to be rich and then to notice. So that would be actually getting to the end, like, in other words, like Shlomo. Like you could have everything and then say, well, now what is this everything for? And then, well, one basic reason this is better is because then people can't say, well, the reason you're saying that you're that being rich is not important is just because you have resentment, right? Just because it's just a sour grapes, just cope. That's one reason. The Medrash says that, right? It's no point someone that's poor to say that. But the deeper reason is that that's not really the place of this idea, right? Of this understanding. The understanding that the practical level is not the entire thing, or is not the main thing, or is not the highest thing, isn't something that is there to help people. And it does help people, but it's not why it helps them. It's not there to help people that, that haven't been successful. Just like the idea that there are better things to be gained in this life than wealth. It isn't here to give chizuk to poor people, right? It does give chizuk to poor people, and it should. And the chizuk that it gives them is true. Because it's true that the higher principle, by its definition, is going to surpass the lower ones, right? Even if wealth is a good, it's even higher goods don't need wealth, or at least don't need them so much. But that's not its real place, right? And it's very sad. One of the great things to be sad about in the world. One of the great, one of the great galuta shechina is that the poor people are closer to it than the rich people. And that's sad for the shechina. It's not only sad for us, because it's putting her in the wrong place. It means that she's the one that comforts the afflicted, which is true. And it's a very big thing, and it's part of God's description of himself, But that's not God's correct place, right? God's real place is to comfort the rich people. In other words, the successful people, the successful intellectually, the successful morally, the successful practically. In other words, if you're a tzaddik and you do every halach and shulchan aruch, and you do every mitzvah in the Mussar Sefer, then you might realize what Chassidus is for or what Kabbalah is for. Otherwise, it's very useful, but that's not what it's really for. That's not its correct place. And then you'll get to it in a complete way, in a healthy way, because it's really not there to negate the lower levels. It's not to negate, it's to surpass them, right? It's not to overcome them, but to overthrow their primacy, right? The only thing we need to do to everything is to overthrow its primacy. It's not the most important thing. It's a thing, it's a good thing, but not the thing. That's the only thing, right? And if you can't do that, then you get stuck breaking things and saying that they're not things at all, which is destructive, which is part of the Galuta Shechina itself, that it has to destroy good things in order to exist. Okay, that's enough for that. So that's one reason why it's important to go in the correct order, or to understand the correct order of things. Another thing, which you notice when you see this, is, and so that's, in other words, that's one reason why it's not separate, these levels. You can't say, well, we're just going to do philosophy, we're just going to do Kabbalah, we're just going to do theology, and we're going to ignore everything lower. Although you could do that, that's not the correct place to do it. The second thing is that, just like we understand for every level of organization, and maybe these are the same idea, but you'll think about it, which is that higher levels of organization also reorganize the lower ones, right? So, for example, and one of the things the Rambam quotes in Shemona Prakim in the beginning is, if you're an animal, then many of the animal things you do, you're going to do the same way as humans do, right? You're going to eat and reproduce and things like that. But if you're a human, you're not like sort of two stories. You're an animal, and then there's humans. That's not even how human beings are built. although in some way it looks like that in the body, and there's like some image of that. That's not really how it is. Because, for example, for humans to reproduce, they can't actually reproduce just like animals. They have to use their mind for it, right? You have to use your intellect to, even to seduce your wife or to seduce a partner. You can't do it in the exact same way which an animal can do it, which is quite simple on the animal level. It needs to work with the added complexity or added levels of organization of the human level. And if you do it otherwise, it's bad. It's not going to be human. But in general, you can't even. In general, humans can't even survive, just foraging for food like a cat. You got to have society. And what this means is that the higher levels also reorganize the lower levels and give them a new meaning, give them a new place. Although they might have a similar function, but they give them a new place. So in a very similar way, and I see this is a very interesting thing that you notice when you read Kabbalah and you read, what's the higher levels of explanation for Torah, and then you read the simple things, is that the simple things now seem to have different kinds of organization. They seem to look differently. Not only because there's like another pshat, there's like another, I could tell you the side of the pasuk. No, because suddenly, similar to like how in a human, like suddenly the different organs or different parts, they stand in a different place, they're in a different location, different things seem more important than others, so there's a different hierarchy, a different organization. The same thing happens when you understand higher levels of understanding of organization in the text, in the Torah, and then you read the lower levels, that they receive a different importance. They receive a different kind of organization. They receive a different kind of understanding. And this is something that actually many people have done quite successfully. And sometimes this is known as bringing then the Kabbalah to Pshat, or explaining it within the terms of this world and things like that. But it's not really that. It's not explaining anything. What it is sort of like the light that the higher thing shines on the lower things. Now there's more light. Now you can see more details. Or now the details look differently. It's a different color light. It's a different prism of light. So you could see things differently. And this actually turns things over. And what we're going to talk about right now is a really good example of something that can be explained and not only can be explained, must be understood in the original terms in which it was explained, in other words, by reference to the highest principles of humanity, but then also leads you to re-evaluate the entire story that you were told. And this re-evaluation gives birth to extremely radical in the sense of very extremely different from the Pshat, extremely different from what we seem to be used to being the Pshat, understandings of the whole story of the yetzias mitzrayim, of the Torah, which surrounds the story of yetzias mitzrayim in some sense. And this radicalness is, we have to talk about radicalness or radicality, I don't know how you say, for a minute. It's very easy to be radical and to say, well, the Jews have this story, we're going to change the story, we're going to make it for modern people or whatever. And that's great. But it also often seems to just, change the story or change the meaning or change the, we're going to reread the text. We're going to make a new pshat. And you sort of lose the connection to what you were trying to reinterpret if you just make it into something else. And that's besides for like the thing that people worry about. So it's just external influences. I don't know if that's a real problem, but this is a real problem. Like when you sort of lose the way of this being a real thing, and it starts to become a way of saying something else. And that's not a good way. It's not a good way to live. Like have this like, it's very hard, not good to serve two masters, right? Not very, very, very not pleasant. But if what you're doing, what we want to do, or what I'm doing here is to show that when you go just straight up, you take one word or one idea, one concept, you go straight up through Pshat, Rash, Side, then you get to some freedom, right? You get to some kind of most exalted understanding of what it is. And then when from that, like from the top of the mountain, when you look down at where you came from, not where you came from, at the mountain you're standing on, then the mountain looks different from on top than it looks from the bottom. And maybe it's not correct to then go down and tell the bottom how it looks from the top? This is a very serious question. It's part of the actual dialectic of the question that we're going to discuss. But it definitely changes it. And this is not an external thing. This is not like I was pressured by some cultural influences to say something or to make something. It's muchach mitoiche. It happened, and it's also relevant. It's also very relevant to everything that we do. So this is enough for prefacing things. Okay, so let's start.